I've made several videos on this channel about our battle with the invasive Chinese privet here in the woods of Magnolia Bend. Since discovering the problem, I've been more than a little dismayed at the prospect of having to slowly eradicate it from the entire property. Well, about a year ago now, we ordered a couple of new perennials for up by the house. They were two different types of Yaupon holly, which is a common native shrub in South Mississippi. When we went to plant them, I remember Kiyomi saying to me, "This sure does look a lot like the privet we've been fighting in the woods, doesn't it?" So we broke a twig of it off and took it back into the woods to compare it to the privet. And sure enough, the two plants were one and the same. It would appear that we've been spending all this time and energy removing a plant that's native to the ecosystem. But how did I get that so wrong? Why did I think that this native holly was an invasive species from another continent? To answer that question, we're going to have to go back in time about 300 years or so, to when the Europeans first established a permanent settlement in this area. You see, for thousands of years, the indigenous peoples here and across the southeast made frequent use of fire to shape the landscape. They did this for various reasons, such as improving hunting, clearing travel routes of underbrush, and encouraging the growth of edible plants. Based on fire scars found in the rings of old-growth trees, we know that the forests of this region were intentionally burned every 1 to 3 years, which partly explains why the environment was dominated by spacious longleaf pine savannas and coastal flatwoods. Pinus palustrius, the longleaf pine, was the foundational species that defined the wilderness of the southeastern United States during that time period. And it was precisely the frequent and widespread forest fires that allowed this tree to become the backbone of the ecosystem. The longleaf pine is a fire specialist. It has some extreme adaptations that allow it to survive and thrive with frequent fire. The most important one is that, unlike other southern pines and hardwoods, it doesn't grow vertically for several years at the start of its life. Instead, it goes through a grass stage in which it sits at ground level as a tight bundle of needles. This protects the bud in the center and allows it to resist low-intensity fires and survive repeated burns. Meanwhile, competitors like oak and sweet gum seedlings get killed by fire over and over. So with a burn every 1 to 3 years, the hardwood seedlings never get tall enough to escape the fire. Shrubs stay small and scattered, and vines like greenbrier and Virginia creeper don't form dense tangles. This results in plenty of sunlight reaching the forest floor, which is important because the longleaf pine is very intolerant of shade. The seedlings need lots of sunlight to grow, so they need the fire to clear out everything around them. Once the longleaf finally exits the grass stage and begins growing upward, its bark becomes thick and the tree stretches tall with branches high off the ground. This protects it from the repeated fires that damage other trees. Thanks to these fire adaptations, the longleaf pine survived when others didn't. That's why it was the keystone species shaping the structure of this entire region, covering 90 million acres across the southeast. But today, only about 5% of that ecosystem remains. Starting in the mid-1800s, vast areas of longleaf pine forest were clear-cut for lumber and the production of materials such as turpentine, tar, and pitch. Land was also cleared for farming, then abandoned or replanted with faster-growing pines like the loblolly. Then, in the 1920s, fire began to be actively suppressed. Without frequent burns, the longleaf pine stood no chance of competing against hardwoods and other types of pine. Forest understories grew increasingly dense and filled in with native and invasive shrubs and vines. Now, when we first moved back here and started managing this section of woods, I wasn't aware of any of this. I didn't know that clearcutting and fire exclusion had dramatically altered the landscape from its previous form. But I did get the sense that something was wrong as I observed the hardwood saplings, massive tangles of vines, and impenetrable Yaupon thickets. I knew that I wasn't looking at a healthy forest system. Unfortunately, I came to the conclusion that the problem was an invasive species that had overtaken the woods. And that fear wasn't entirely unfounded, because there is some Chinese privet growing here and there on the margins. But as we've seen, the issue is more systemic than a single rogue invader. In her 2004 master's thesis, Stephanie Dupree noted that dense stands of Yaupon holly have replaced the previously open rangelands of the post-oak savanna, a 3 million acre ecological region in eastern Texas. She states that, quote, "This plant is not perceived as problematic when present in low numbers. However, without proper management, Yaupon becomes an invasive plant, reducing the quantity and diversity of herbaceous vegetation, presumably due to its thick canopy and by outcompeting other plants for sunlight and nutrients. This becomes a problem for wildlife managers and landowners who try to maximize biodiversity." And this is exactly what has happened here in Magnolia Bend. Clearcutting and subsequent fire exclusion have disrupted the natural environment and created conditions that allow Yaupon holly to grow out of control, to the detriment of other species. Alright, well, what can be done about it? I initially hoped that I could have someone come in and do a low-intensity prescribed burn on the woods, but after speaking with someone at the Mississippi Forestry Commission, I realized that no one was going to take that risk due to the surrounding human structures. But that same person informed me of a process called mulching, where they bring in a skid steer with a mulching attachment and chop up all the underbrush and saplings up to a certain diameter. It's not as good as fire, but it does achieve some of the same things. It clears out the understory and opens up the canopy for sunlight to reach the forest floor. Then he told me about a grant that the Forestry Commission received via the Restore Act, which is funded by penalties paid by BP to the federal government after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. Specifically, the Commission got $7.25 million to enhance forest resources that are vital to the health of the Gulf Coast, including activities like prescribed burns and mulching. I've applied for the grant, and I'm waiting to see if they'll give it to me. If they do, I'll use the money to have someone come in and grind up a lot of the smaller stuff in the woods, leaving the larger hardwoods and pines. That should open up the canopy enough for me to selectively plant some longleaf pines and other native species that the property currently lacks. If not, then I'll start clearing it myself with a chainsaw and a brush cutter. It'll just take longer. But the goal will be the same: to thin out the woods and slowly shift it back into balance. And as the neighboring woodlands continue to be cleared for new subdivisions and apartment complexes, improving the health of the natural environment we have control over will be more important than ever.